So I just wanted to say a few words about the center, its mission. I'm going to introduce Morgan, the moderator today, and then I'll let them take over. The Center for Transformative Media is Camden's interdisciplinary research hub dedicated to investigating the transformative potential of emerging media technologies in shaping grassroots creativity and promoting social change. We explore the many creative ways in which media technologies interact with societies. We look at how emerging media technologies transform society, but also our creative potential to develop new technologies from below. These are just some of our research projects and events. And particularly one of our missions this year is to study AI as media. Looking at AI not just as a technology, but a cultural and communicative force that shapes creativity, knowledge production, and civic life. And we look at how it transforms urban spaces, storytelling, journalism, community engagement, and society. This is our website. There's a QR code there. You can scan and to look more at what we do. You can also just, Google CTM Northeastern. You're going to get to it. There you can see our affiliated faculty, events, and research projects, and everything that we do. We also have a newsletter that comes up every month. So if you want to keep, up with what we do, subscribe to our newsletter and our social media channels. And these are just some events that are coming up after this. We have a film screening next week. We have 2 episodes of our AI webinar in February and March. We have events on gaming and another book talk in April, and other events there that didn't have enough space in the slides to put. So today, today's event is a research jam. It's one of their kinds of events organized by our CTM affiliate member, Morgan DiCesare. Morgan is a scholar of rhetorical history and a postdoctoral teaching associate in communication studies. Her work underscores the importance of social relationships in retelling queer and trans histories. Through readings of oral histories, collected first-hand documents and memories, her research takes up daily life in the 70s and presents to address queer and trans modes of living and world-making beyond those presented by institutional sources such as medical and newspaper records. She has published her work in the Quarterly Journal of Speech, Rhetoric, Politics, and Culture, Women's Studies in Communication, and PATO. So today's event is called Transmedia Histories. Explores questions like how have trans people created and critiqued media, how do trans people media histories shape the present and future. And the roundtable that you're going to see seeks to answer these questions and more through an interdisciplinary engagement with transmedia production and reception in contexts ranging from archives and novels to zines and online spaces. So with that, I'll give the word to Morgan. I'm not sure if you need that, but sure. It's up to you.
Thank you, and thanks to the Center for Transformative Media for hosting this. I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then we will get started. The format for this is going to be pretty straightforward. We're going to ask, I have a handful of questions prepared. We'll ask a couple of them, then we'll turn it over to the floor, and when the floor questions wind down, we have more questions to fill in the rest of the hour. So that'll be pretty much the layout. First, I'm going to introduce Eamon Schlotterbach, who is a postdoctoral teaching associate in the writing program. Her research attends to the poetics of self-creation and the work of poetic political imagination in transgender life writing and fiction. And we also have Ann DeVito, who is an assistant professor of communication science and communication studies and director of the Northeastern University Sociotechnical Equity and Agency Lab. An expert in social and critical computing, her research takes a qualitative, interpretivist, trans-feminist informed approach to making sociotechnical systems more useful and less harmful to marginalized communities and users. She is dedicated to epistemically just approaches to research and design, centering close-in community knowledge and needs with the aim of empowering marginalized users to take control of their own computational social environments. She publishes in top computer science venues such as CHI, CSCW, and is it Tokai? Tokai. Thank you. So to start us off and to get a general sense of our research, I'd like to ask, how do you approach trans communities in your research?
Well, there's kind of two sides to that. Methodologically, very carefully, deliberately, and with a real focus on making sure that we are keeping everyone safe before we get very excited about publishing new results, that kind of thing, especially right now. Philosophically, theoretically, a larger approach, as close in as we possibly can, right? We are looking in my lab group and in my personal research to benefit from and keep ourselves honest based on being epistemically just. So really only doing research that we have a direct stake in, right? That we are part of, ideally, the community, instead of doing it from an external perspective, which I think gives us a more realistic sense of exactly what kind of threats, but also exactly what kind of joy there is, what kind of potential there is for that in the online media spaces that I tend to research. You know, a lot of online communities, broadcast social media, that kind of thing. But doing it close in, our hope is we do less harm and we get a deeper story.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm a literature scholar, so like sometimes it feels very disconnected from the community, but I think there's kind of two ways I would approach this question. First, I used to work at the Digital Transgender Archive at Northeastern, which is run by KJ Rawson. And we'd often invite community members to help us run the archive, for instance, like reaching out to like independent people with archives that don't have like institutional backing, or interviewing activists who were at historical events who could help us like identify people in photos or whatever. In my research right now, beyond the DTA, I'm reading trans literature, trans authored literature, and I also try to draw not only from like transgender studies scholarship for theory, but also like theory and criticism produced by non-academic community members. Alison Escalante and Rachel Pollack have both like deeply informed some of my methodologies. Yeah.
Thank you. And I forgot to mention I'll also be answering the questions. Yeah, so in my work, I tend to look historically at trans people's lives. So what that really means is attending to what's both there and what's left out at the same time. So recognizing what and why gets saved, or what and why it gets saved, but then on the other hand, who had some stake in preserving that item. There are reasons why things get into archives that have nothing to do with the lives of the subjects that are involved in those archival productions. And so I'm really interested in those moments. What are the things that historical subjects have already said about themselves? How are those preserved? But then also what doesn't get preserved. So one example of this from my work is with Holly Woodlawn, who is, I was just talking to David about this, but a hilarious trans woman who became a Warhol superstar in the 70s. But part of her life, she published a autobiography co-written with like a major publishing house in the 90s, reflecting on her life in the 70s. She's a Puerto Rican trans woman, and one thing that happens in her biography is she deeply plays down her Puerto Rican identity in order to sort of bring forth her trans identity, because that's part of what made her most famous. So in those moments, it's recognizing that there's a publisher who's making decisions about how and what gets produced, not just the subjects themselves deciding to get their own stories out there. Yeah.
I might follow up.
Yeah, for sure.
So I'm kind of immediately noticing, despite the fact that we're coming from three pretty different areas, we all seem to be pushing against this pervasive telling of our stories without us, and deciding on what the story should be without us. And I have found so often in my research that we are fighting against a narrative that has nothing to do with our realities whatsoever. I'm curious if y'all have found that too.
Absolutely.
Sure, so I'm a scholar of transgender autobiography, which is the most it's the most important cultural form in transgender culture of the 20th century, I would argue. up until about like 15 years ago, it was the only thing that trans people could publish about trans people, pretty much, with very few exceptions. And it's also heavily constrained, as Morgan was saying, by medical interests, legal interests, having to appeal to a mainstream cis audience for sympathy, people not knowing what a trans person is and having to really explain themselves in the simplest possible way. So definitely critiquing and pushing back against some of those, but also I want to like pay attention to like the difficulties and the way that trans writers have like found ways of subverting the norm while seeming to inhabit it.
For sure. I think that builds really nicely into our next question, which is, what common assumptions about trans life does your writing challenge or your work challenge?
It's a long list.
I think there's two big things. So first, what I just said, the trans memoir is often, within transgender studies at least, understood as an entirely 100% universally conservative genre. And for good reason, a lot of them are pretty conservative. But I also want to like, think about the complexities, and I think about somebody like Christine Jorgensen, who's the first American trans celebrity and introduced the word transsexuality to Americans in the 50s. In her autobiography, she writes something where she's telling a story about a very traditionally feminine, white, heterosexual woman that seems to go along with all these kind of like medical and conservative understandings of transness. But she also lies to a pharmacist to obtain hormones, which she has no scientific knowledge of whether they will work or not, to like transform her. Like she's taking a radical, massive leap into the unknown in ways that I don't think can be constrained to like a conservative understanding of gender, especially not femininity. And the other thing that I think I push back against a lot is the idea of gender dysphoria, which is the medicalized term that describes the negative feelings associated with being trans that require us to get medical transition. I think, one, trans people don't like being like pathologized like that. Like there's a reaction against feeling like there's something wrong with us. And two, sometimes dysphoria becomes an overarching or overdetermined element in trans narratives, like we're doomed to misery. So it gets a lot of pushback, but I actually am kind of pushing back against the pushback a little bit. I want to try to find out what's useful about dysphoria. So in my research, I try to think about dysphoria not in terms of its medical baggage, but as an affect, and thinking about dysphoria as like an emotional response to a world that misperceives me, or that was not designed for my flourishing. And in that way, I think there is some like, political value to a term that has a ton of political medical baggage.
That's very cool. That's a very cool way to go about this. Picking up off a little bit off that, so I say that I have two main things that I keep running into. The first, and remember, this is in the context of online space, especially broadcast social media platforms. The first thing I run into is this notion that transness is a monolith, right? There is a strong desire to assert a monoculture online that is really, really aided and abetted by the fact that only certain people are safe to speak out online. Certain people have that ability to weather the horribleness that I will cover in my second thing. And because of that, we get this odd picture of transness from online that I think it harms the external perception, but it also harms folks that are trying to figure themselves out, right? There's this mold now that you have to fit in. And unfortunately, in broadcast social media, it's really become this notion that like transness is inherently tied up in whiteness, which immediately cuts out a ton of trans people. And it's because, who can be safely visible? The very few, like, white trans women that have, like, good jobs and don't really have to worry about their employers following them inappropriately or firing them if they say something that they don't want, right? And that has created this atmosphere where who is very, very visible becomes the larger perception of the culture, which just isn't true, right? As soon as you actually dive in and start interviewing people, it's very, very clear, no, this is a corner. It's a loud corner. It's a corner that keeps getting like put on the news and stuff, but it is not the whole thing. It is far from the whole thing. This is especially true when it comes to economic class too, right? Like one myth that is kind of developed in these online spaces is that there is some sort of connection between transness and middle classness. Interview trans people, you will very clearly see this is not a thing, right? Most of the people I interview, that gift card, like the $25 gift card actually means something, right? Like it's not a trivial thing. And usually I wind up like contributing to GoFundMe, something like that. So there are these weird monolithic assumptions that have cropped up that just do not hold past one interview, honestly. The other big myth that I keep running into is that visibility is a positive thing for trans people. It can be, don't get me wrong, it can be. Pretty sure I have a job because of my visibility as a trans woman, but for the vast majority of people, it is straight up a trap. It is a lie that is sold to us by platform owners because, you know what? We're great targets, and hate and harassment sells ads, right? So we're money makers in the sense that we're very, very fun to harass and target. But they don't tell you that part. They tell you, make yourself visible, and somehow, through magic steps we're not going to disclose, that will mean nobody will want to discriminate against you anymore. That will somehow move the culture single-handedly. When the reality that we've seen in my research again and again and again, like every single study I have done for the past 7, 8 years, no, for the vast majority of people, you are stepping into a minefield that is like over-tweaked to trigger immediately if you step even near it. So this myth of visibility will solve everything, like it is a harmful myth. It's a genuinely harmful myth and something that we try to push against at least.
Ask a real quick clarifying question. When you say broadcast social media, what is that? Is that like as opposed to what? Like
Blue Sky, Twitter, anything where you are putting it out to a larger group, usually without a bunch of barriers in front of it. I would contrast it to things like Discord, for example, where we would call that kind of semi-private.
Got it.
Yeah, where you're scoped, but it can still get out.
Got it.
Yeah, thank you. And building on assumptions, let's see. I think I see them a couple ways looking at trans history. The assumptions I mainly have approached is the idea that trans people historically were either involved in like street politics, medical transition, or newspaper scandals. Sort of that the only place to find trans history is in newspaper records where there are scandals, publications about street activism, or medical journals where people like Harry Benjamin and what's his name, company, John Money would publish their own works. And I tend to look at how trans people's lives exceeded those in very narrow scopes, right? So like Hollywood Lawn, for instance, decided she got $3,000 from her boyfriend to go have surgery in Baltimore at Johns Hopkins, and she got to Baltimore with a friend and then blew all the money at a party for a month in Baltimore instead of getting surgery, and then returned to New York City without any money and just went back to her life without her boyfriend. So it's things like that where it just completely rewrites what you would expect of a trans, I think David's point about how trans people have kind of been forced to narrate their medical histories as sort of this like very clear teleology, like I had dysphoria, I had transition, and now I have euphoria, and my life is all better. And just that is not the reality of trans people's lives medically. Yeah, and then newspaper scandals, a lot of trans historians look at newspaper records because it's one of the few sources, because as Ethan also said, trans people can only get their lives published in autobiographical works, so it's secondhand accounts of trans lives, usually scandalous ones, as in the case of people like Christine Jorgensen, who interestingly, to add on to what you were saying, by the 70s was a circuit speaker. She was like traveling around universities, giving like talks about sex, like sexuality and sex, to college audiences, which is just a fascinating farness from her moment as like a blonde bombshell entering the United States in the 50s. But Yeah, did you all want to add anything to any of those questions? Or? Cool. Then I think we will open it up for questions, and if there aren't questions, we will carry on with our questions. Yeah.
Would you mind describing like the methods that you use for your scholarship?
Yeah, I'm always happy to talk about methods. I try to restrain myself because it can eat up a lot of time. So my lab approaches things, and I personally approach things through an interpretivist qualitative lens, right? We are kind of post-positivist. Everything comes from a viewpoint. Like the view from nowhere is the one thing I have banned in my lab, right? We do not do that view from nowhere nonsense. We do not do things can be objective, because that's literally not how human brains work. We can't be objective. So we use mostly qualitative methods. Occasionally we do some mixed methods work with partners. But really everything starts with the interview for us. The interview remains our most important tool. It is the most versatile, and it is the easiest way to dig deep into someone's life experience. And what we're usually trying to do is figure out better ways to build systems, but that's gotta be from people's life experience, right? That can't just be like, what would be a cool widget? It has to be, okay, has this widget, like a widget like this harmed you in the past? How can we stop it in the future? And that's very useful to do in an interview format. We also use group formats, something called ARC, Asynchronous Remote Communities, where we bring folks into an online community that's kind of purpose-built. And that's really, really good when you need to solve problems as a group, especially if there's intergroup conflict. They're also very, very fun to do, because you're essentially like moderating a little custom-built online community for a little while. I love doing those. But it's great because I think you'd be surprised by how many people without technical training can substantively, as a group, work through technical problems with just a little bit of prompting. And that lets our results not stop at these options or possibilities. You, the completely disconnected developer, figure it out. Good luck. We try not to stop there. We try to stop at, okay, here are all the options. We talk them over with a broad group of trans people, and we're pretty sure we should try this because it's the safest thing. So it's trying to use methods that give the folks we're working with and for as much control as late in the pipeline as possible. Kind of our methodological focus. And like I said earlier, we're also always trying to make sure this is epistemically just. So we're trying to make sure every project is run by people who are actually impacted by it, right? Like most of my personal research is on trans femininity at the moment and how it's affected by technology. It's not the only thing my lab does, but it's what I tend to lead. And we try to get people that are in the thick of it to be in charge of things, because it keeps us more honest.
I'd say my research methods are not particularly interesting. They're mainly the literature mainstay of closed reading, archives. The one maybe thing I would say is one of my research interests is auto theory, which is like a blend of autobiography and critical theory or philosophy, and I think that becomes like a recognizable form of theory through trans literature. I think it has a longer history, but it's really a cluster of trans authors from the 2000s, 2010s. So I've also tried to do some auto theory of my own, so drawing on personal experience, complicating theory through drawing on personal experience.
Yeah, well, I have to say, archival methods are incredibly interesting.
Mine are not.
Yeah. But in any case, yeah, I use rhetorical methods, archival methods, close reading, a lot of discursive analysis type stuff. So much more on the what's interesting about what other people have put into archives and why have they put it there. I think maybe the most interesting move archivally that I find interesting is treating archives not as like stable repositories, but treating them as active sites of meaning making. So instead of assuming that archives are where like dead and dusty records are held, seeing that the fact of preservation versus like getting rid of something is itself a statement that makes contemporary influence, leads to a very particular chain of how history is told from that point forward. Which is, as I think KJ at the DTA has written about extensively, particularly complicated historically for trans people. right? Like how do you categorize somebody we would now consider as a trans person, who at the time at best would have been described as like a gender deviant? Do you call them trans? Do you call them transsexual? Do you call them transgender? Do you call them a cross-dresser? Do you just write gender deviant in the archive? But each term changes how somebody's able to find it. So it completely shifts how a user then engages with that material.
What do you all think about speculative archives, and like, do you use that practice, or do you like know anyone who uses it that you are compelled by?
So what do you mean by speculative archive?
I've seen like increasingly like this. I think I've seen it in filmmaking, but like the practice of creating something that the archive doesn't have. So like kind of filling gaps in the archive.
Yeah, so it's amazing. That reminds me of, it's not out of trans studies, it's out of like black studies, but Saidiya Hartman's critical fabulation, the idea of like building out a story from what is a violent absent archive due to like particular racialized histories, and then treating that as the basis for then telling a story about a life. It's a really beautiful book, Wayward Lives, I think it's called. Yeah, Wayward Lives is like, it won a bunch of awards. It's a gorgeous read about that. But in terms of speculative archive, I have a very different story about speculation in archives, which is one of the people I study claimed to be D.B. Cooper, the like skyjacker who ransomed a flight in the or hijacked a plane in the 70s, ransomed the passengers for $200,000, then jumped out the back with a parachute and like supposedly landed in the woods and disappeared. So in 1976, a trans woman named Barbara Dayton told two of her friends that she was D.B. Cooper and had committed the crime. Her argument, or what she said, was she dressed up, she had already transitioned, so she dressed up as a man, committed the crime as D.B. Cooper, landed in the woods, took off her men's clothing, and proceeded as a woman driving through rural Oregon with the money. So there's a speculative archive, but not quite the one you were talking about. But yeah.
So I don't do that personally, but I've written about a couple trans approaches to speculative archives. There's a really great book called Confessions of the Fox by Jordy Rosenberg, which totally picks up on Saidiya Hartman and literally cites Saidiya Hartman and other scholars. And it's a reimagining of Jack Shepherd, who's the inspiration for the main character of the Threepenny Opera, Mac the Knife. He's this like master thief, and it's reimagined as a trans man, and it's really intentionally putting trans and queer and non-white elements into this archival story as, I think, an intentional act of critical fabulation. And then there's another book I'm currently writing about right now called Valid. It's called an autofiction, so it's like part memoir, but part science fiction story, and the conceit is the author is telling her life story to this like oppressive AI, and so she literally has to build an AI for the AI to be able to like understand her, but because she's trans, it's like kind of short-circuiting how the AI is able to interpret her.
So I don't do much archival work, but just briefly, we do some work with speculative design. And I think that is actually becoming one of the most important parts of our work, because when you're talking about what is, especially when it comes to trans folks, it is very easy to focus exclusively on the horrible, exclusively on the deficit model, right? And this is not my original thing by any means. This is very influenced by one of my close colleagues, Alexandra Toe, which was also a CAMD faculty member. But the speculative elements, letting people have an activity or two in a project where they can fill in gaps with hope, it is, I think, pushing us in a very positive direction towards things that don't just patch holes and don't just stop the horribleness, but actively let us seek joy. And I think a lot of trans technology is best when it lets us see joy. And we're never going to get there unless we let people just sometimes put out just wild ideas. Just absolutely wild ideas that, at first it's like, okay, that's a little bit far. And then you think about it, it's like, actually we could do that. Technically, we could do that if we put the effort in. And that's become a really important part of the practice. Also, I hope that story is true. About DiCesare. Because you know what? If that is true, good for her.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the thing about it is, well, they can't prove it. No one can prove it's not true, so it might as well be true. That's how I'm approaching it.
It's true for me from now on.
Exactly. Yeah, the couple that did it, Ron and Pat Foreman, they wrote, it's a hilarious book. It's called The Legend of D.B. Cooper, Death by Natural Causes. They self-published it. And they also reported all of their evidence to the FBI, who basically told them to, go away. But, yeah.
I love the way you guys talk about the vivid lives of trans people. I think oftentimes it is misunderstood. And so I'm wondering how you see the role of community, of the trans community, and having a sense of community. How does that come up in your research?
I can go first. I mean, I had some really tense examples of community. So something I'm really interested in is how do we care for the trans past? That's the central question of the book I'm working on. But what does it mean to care for the trans past? And something I've run into is these moments where people are deeply connected, but also deeply at odds with one another. So one really powerful instance of this is, if you didn't know, Holly Woodlawn, Andy Warhol superstar who I've been talking about, lived on the streets of New York City doing sex work in the same circles as Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. In her autobiography, she goes on this tangent that is deeply anti-Black, deeply anti-Marsha P. Johnson. She has a line that's and her wig was on straight, and that was the best thing that came out of Stonewall, was that Marsha P. Johnson's wig was on straight. So it's these moments where she saw something very different in her community than Marsha P. Johnson saw in those same streets, in that same neighborhood, at that same time. Marsha P. Johnson, founder of STAR, was building a trans community for sex work, or for children, by doing sex work so they could get fed. And Holly Woodlawn was worried about her acting career. And so it's moments like that that tell you a very different story about what trans life in the same neighborhoods in 1970 really looked like.
So in the kind of work I tend to do, trans community is often what we are trying to protect and foster. Part of what we have found again and again, study after study, is that online spaces, online communities, even networks through broadcast, social media, are crucial community spaces in a way that they are just not for so many other groups, right? And you cannot write them off. You can't write them off because they are our primary source of health information, for example. But they're also a source of solidarity and getting acquainted with the realities, right? So we have really focused a lot of the time on what constitutes trans community and how do we keep it from breaking apart in systems that do not want to be famous for being sites of trans community. We saw this very recently with Blue Sky. Trans community and Black community made Blue Sky. It was a nonsense nothing website before those two groups showed up. As soon as more attractive people to sell ads to showed up, even the CEO has been very clear, we don't want this to be a trans site, right? And that has eroded the possibility for community on there. But we see people fighting. We see people fighting, and we want to do work that supports people fighting for that community and not lose it again. Because this is migration 4 or 5 if we have to migrate over to yet another platform. And every migration is losing people. Every migration is losing part of the culture, a lot of the data, especially the important health information that we share. So we're trying to protect those. At the same time, one thing we haven't shied away from, and I think it's been important not to shy away from, is inter-community conflict, right? That is no one's favorite thing to write about. It's not necessarily what we get into the business to write about. But we can't ignore it either, because there are internal and external threats that we constantly see having negative effects, right? It's not all external. Sometimes it's us not treating each other well enough. Often because, we're pushing against this monolithic notion of what transness is. Sometimes because our conflicts over what it is spill out into, harassment campaigns, doxing campaigns, stuff like that. And I think it's been really, really important for us to look at that instead of trying to ignore it in favor of, painting a rosy picture. It's been important to show what's actually there, not what is politically convenient. And I think that has let us move towards ways of identifying and kind of short-circuiting the ways we can accidentally, a lot of time, harm each other, right? And I think that is really important to building real community. Something my wife reminds me of all the time. Community is not like the people you like. It is the people you are in solidarity with. Especially the people that maybe you don't personally get along with, that you need to be in solidarity with. And by looking at the inter-community issues, trying to find ways to address them, we can make substantive community happen instead of what is substantively cliques, which is what happens a lot of the time and is not a sustainable way to transfer knowledge, not a sustainable way to onboard new folks into some of the harsher realities of being trans, which you need to be prepared for, or those first few years are not going to go well. So I gotta look at the bad stuff too and find ways to mitigate it.
I didn't have an answer, but when you were talking, I thought of something which I was thinking about some of the online conflicts, and I learned while working at the DCA that we've always been like this. I found there's a journal called Transistors from the 90s, which has really interesting stuff in it, but it also details ton of infighting about one of the hormones was made from horse urine, and was that animal cruelty? There was some kind of conference event for trans women who had gotten bottom surgery, and there was infighting about whether that was exclusionary or not. And I guess one of the things that I think is really interesting about trans communities is that they come in and out of existence really quickly, and they form really complex language and ideologies. We can trace since the 90s the preferred terms going from MTF to M2F to transgender woman to trans woman. It'll be done, or it'll be different by the time we're done, probably. But I think in my research, I want to take seriously some of those little snapshot moments. People are always kind of getting things wrong in those different iterations of community, but there's also really interesting different ways of thinking about trans experience in each of them. In the Transistors journal, for instance, they had this idea about a divine femininity informing trans womanhood. And I think that really leads into some weird, conservative, mystical ideas about gender, but I also think there's kind of a certain beauty to it and a certain way of connecting to, speaking of archival speculation, the way our past has been robbed to us, a way of connecting back to the ancient myths and spiritual practices that have been rewritten without our input.
Yeah, I'm thinking about this question of visibility and how you sort of balance the need to sort of document or reveal what it means for people to be safe. And I'm asking because I'm from Nigeria and I'm a journalist, and today someone was telling me we have this same-sex marriage prohibition act, which has been there for a while. But someone was telling me that there was an NGO that actually took the government's call and then got some parts of the act struck down. And I was like, oh, that would make a great story. But also I was worried that if you tell a story, they're like, oh, actually parts of our anti-gay law have been struck down. You can also have a bunch of people be aware of something that they were not aware of before, countrywide. And so I'm just wondering, especially in a crime like this, how do you sort of balance there's a need to know this people in the community. This is something that should be archived, something that should be revealed, with sort of overall safety question.
I know that's a really big question. It's not a direct answer, but I think you would really enjoy Trapdoor, edited by Eric Stanley, someone, and Tourmaline. The introduction is about traps and doors and then trapdoors, and basically makes the argument that visibility is a trap, particularly for Black trans women, by way of the reality of like more and more trans women of color appearing on television, but at the same time, disproportionate rates of violence increasing at the same moments. So I think that, and it's like not new at this point, like I think it's from like 2010, 2011. So that's kind of like a question that has been very much addressed recently. But I think to your point, it's just getting more and more pressing in the US, especially. What does it mean to hold on to these things? Who can safely hold on to these things in a way that doesn't lead to people being outed or put in particular situations that they shouldn't be in?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've talked about like the downsides of visibility. I think it's so complicated because like 20 years ago, there would be no chance that Northeastern would host an event like this. There would not be 3 out trans women probably across the whole university working here. But this also means like we're targets of violence to a much greater degree than we were 20 years ago, where we were mostly ignored or considered kind of fringe. And I can actually see in my lifetime, like, things got better for trans people, and now it looks like things are getting worse, and actually, like, I think measurably worse than they were like 5 years ago. So this isn't really like a great answer, but I think like making sure to the best of your ability that like trans people have some kind of agency over their own visibility. I think of Christine Jorgensen again. In her memoirs, she wrote that she was outed by a family member to the press after her surgery, and it was the first American one that hit the news, really. So she was hounded by press. And that was, I can't say with 100% certainty, but I'm 99% sure that's bullshit. She alerted the press herself. She wanted to be a celebrity. And I think that bit her in the ass in some ways. Like, she had a very difficult life. She could not have a normal career after that. But also she was able to have the kind of relationship to fame that she wanted. So I don't think that's a very useful answer, but I think that's the best answer I could do.
Such a good question. I think about these questions like when I should be sleeping a lot of the time. Morgan, I'm so glad you mentioned trapdoor. So to expand on that a little bit, trapdoor's intro has become one of the just like the introductory, like here's what this book is chapter. I would argue it's become one of the most important pieces of trans theory like ever put out there. To the extent that it is now kind of one of the mainstream theories on visibility within computer science and information science, where I do a lot of my work. I've actually used it quite a bit. I've extended that out to a theory of like the trap of algorithmic visibility specifically. So I'm going to kind of be answering from that perspective. It's very, very informed by trapdoor. Like it's literally just taking trapdoor and saying, this is how this works in an algorithmic system, and yeah, it's just as bad as they said, possibly worse. The big thing I keep coming back to as I think about this is, yes, visibility remains super important. And like trans journalists especially, super important to have out there. The key right now is doing this in an informed and self-defense minded way, right? So I have a bunch of experience being very visibly trans online myself. I believe in member research, so when I wanted to write about trans influencers, I spent 2 years doing that, becoming that, right? And it was a super educational experience that made reading Trapdoor go from, oh, this is really interesting, to this is the most important thing I've ever read. I have to make other computer scientists aware of this. That was a big moment. And I really come to a place, and the research that we do really indicates that it is about making sure everybody knows the burden they're taking on, the trouble they're taking on, and making sure that it's very clear to everyone, right? It cannot be a system anymore where good intentions win the day. You kind of have to go in ready to fight a battle. And like you're hoping it doesn't happen, right? You're always hoping it doesn't happen. You're usually not goading it or anything. But there's a good chance it will happen just because of the subject matter, just because of who you are. So I would argue that before you make yourself visible, and before you make other people visible, you've got to make sure they know the possible consequences. And in online spaces, that actually means knowing a little bit about how these actually work on a mechanistic level. There's a thing called folk theories that I write about all the time, because the platforms aren't going to tell us how they work. They'll lie, but they're not going to tell us what's actually going on. And that's not my speculation. That's the fact that I ask people every time I see them, and they're like, "Stop asking, Michael Ann. It's a trade secret." Okay, it's a trade secret that affects people's lives. People are really good at forming theories of how this works, especially when they work together. Before taking on that mantle of visibility as a trans person, you really need to do some deep thinking about, if I post a certain thing a certain way, who's the likely audience going to be? Who's going to get pulled in? And what am I going to do if this goes any level of viral? Because for most people, going viral, that's the point. For us, it is, here comes the monsters. Or here comes the awful people. Because once, the phrase I've come to like for this is breaks containment, right? Once it breaks containment of just a trans audience, most of these systems are wired to be okay, so who's going to engage with it the most past trans people? Transphobes, they'll post a lot of stuff under this. They will. And they won't stop. They'll do this for days and days and days. So you've got to be ready for that. You've got to be ready for the fact that if something succeeds too much, something's coming. But you've also got to be ready for the fact that there are ways to mitigate this. I've seen all kinds of strategies, right? They're one of my favorite people I ever interviewed. She kind of spams hashtags on stuff that transphobes would never encounter because it's way out of kind of their purview, to try to keep things contained. So having strategies for how you're going to keep yourself safe in the first place, and then what you're going to do if you kind of get the horrible side of success, really, really important. And I'd say that's part of being a creator online right now. And I think from what I've seen of a lot of trans journalists especially, that's part of their regular practice. They think this stuff through. They're the ones that tend to last. And in terms of giving visibility to other folks, I think it's incumbent upon all of us that are doing this kind of visibility work, pulling other people in, to pass that knowledge on as much as we can. Explain what might happen, and take steps if you can. Right? When one of my students say we get a best paper or something, we're going to do a security audit before we start, pushing that out to a wide audience, because who knows what's out there. So it's about proactively protecting yourself. I don't think we can abandon visibility entirely, but we have to know what we're stepping into. It can't be a surprise, because it being a surprise, that is lifetime trauma levels of harm at this point. So yeah, it's kind of a self-defense thing now.
We have time for one or two more questions.
So in a lot of the previous questions, we talked a lot about the different methods of infighting and different individual narratives that all combine into this sort of complex web of what constitutes the trans community. So I was wondering, in each of your individual bodies of work, how do you synthesize this rich plethora of different distinct voices into something that could benefit the gestalt of trans people as this collective whole that may not necessarily all agree on what would benefit them?
Yeah. Well, in terms of synthesizing, I don't know that I do that. But in terms of I try to approach it through mess. That's been the way I've been approaching it. So this is Martin Manalanson's work on messiness and what it means to have queer messiness applied to trans people. So what does it mean to take trans people's lives as just as messy as everybody else's life? That trans people are not heroes or villains or victims, that they're real people with full range of human emotions. And to start from that assumption really is where I try to go with my work. Yeah, so I tend to end up less synthesizing and more pointing to the fissures that end up erupting between trans community or trans individuals, usually not even necessarily communities.
In my work on auto theory, one of the things I draw from is Kate Bornstein's memoir, Gender Outlaw. And she describes her style of writing it, which combines different genres, different authors, different she'll throw in images, she'll go out of order in her life. She calls that cut and paste, and she calls that a trans style. And I think she's coyly alluding to like transsexual surgeries. And we can see that again in another autotheoretical text, Susan Stryker's My Words to Victor Frankenstein, where again she's stitching different genres together, this time in reference to Frankenstein's monster, but also again the transsexual body, which is stitched and reshaped. I think I take from both of them like an idea that we can take what's useful and we don't need everything. I had another piece of that, but it escaped me, sorry.
So I've kind of got two answers to this. On the level of individual experience, when we are talking about stuff in the community where we're not necessarily representing ourselves outside of things, I think I agree. The mess is kind of the point in some ways, recognizing that there isn't a monolith here, that's okay, and maybe doing some work to help everybody else realize that's okay. I have encountered, in a lot of my online community work, I've certainly encountered this notion that we have to decide on something, like we have to define what transness is, we have to define what gender is. I would argue these positions are missing the point of transness, and like missing the point of queerness. It's not about strict definitions, right? As soon as you get into the strict definition game, congrats, you've lost the game. Like, that's not the point of it. The point of it is a self-autonomy, right? Like the point of it is figuring it out for yourself and figuring out what you want to be, not like which box you fit in. That said, working in computer science, yeah, computer scientists like boxes, like a lot. Computer scientists really like one answer. So how do we do that? We actually have the folks that we're working with negotiate that through, talk about the trade-offs. And we try to do it in such a way that we are recognizing that sometimes certain voices wind up louder and we're trying to correct for that, right? So I did a study a little while back that was a trans-feminist approach to lesbian dating apps, which was absolutely motivated by my own dislike of how lesbian dating apps were going, 100%. One of the rules we had in that study was, at the end, we were going to take all the perspectives, we were going to sit down as a group, all the participants in the study, and we were going to hash through what we actually wanted to recommend, instead of just saying, some people like this, some people like this, some people like this, take your best guess, which, you know, what will an engineer do with that? The technically easiest thing, which is rarely the one we want to wind up with. Right? So what we did was actually sat down and had people explain, like, why is this part so important to me? And we had some rules. One of the rules was, if a white person is talking about convenience, and a person of color is talking about safety, we're going to go with the safety recommendation, because, like, staying alive kind of trumps this is slightly inconvenient for me. And we put rules like that in place, because otherwise the most harmed voices can get drowned out very, very easily, as almost a cultural default of, like, who is used to being in charge in these spaces. And there was some pushback there, until people started reading each other's stories and realizing, yeah, maybe my desire for convenience actually isn't the important thing here. And I was really impressed how many people in the study like had that moment of, right, I got to give ground on this one. I'm complaining about something that is not as important as someone else's safety. And that's happened every time I've tried to do something like this. Like there is a real desire, once you actually sit people, like as a trans community, down, to give some ground and come up with one solid set of recommendations that is unassailable for whoever is going to wind up developing that in the future. It doesn't always work out, but it does a lot of the time if you help people kind of connect to each other. This is one thing I love about the ARC methodology. You're literally talking to different kinds of people that you might not talk to normally, that do have this overarching identity. And I think it's been really, really important to do that step, because yeah, I like mess in like a personal sense, an interpersonal sense. Powerful people need one voice addressed to them to hear it. And that one voice has to come from the right place, which is almost certainly from a place of negotiation inside the community before we go outside the community.
And is that done through the asynchronous online?
It is, yeah. Our last prompt is usually what I call the reconciliation round, where we all kind of like the staff, project staff literally goes, we go through all the transcripts and everything, and we look, okay, what are the remaining big points of conflict within the group? Let's sit down and try to hammer out what the right answers are as a group. It is my favorite part of ARC at this point. We didn't do it until like 3 or 4 ARCs in. Now I do it every single time because it's so productive at getting to one answer that's really solid, really defensible, which in computer science, like, you give them one answer, or they're going to go wild with it in a bad way and just take a bunch of guesses that you don't want. So.
Do you all have final thoughts? I think we're wrapping up. So. All right, thank you all for coming out. Round of applause for the panel. And I think we're around for another 20-ish, half an hour, so if you want to talk, we'll be happy to talk. And otherwise, thank you again.
Thank you.